The security footage was already queued up on the screen. The conference room fell silent as executives leaned forward, watching a warehouse employee sign off on inventory transfers that had emptied thousands of dollars worth of equipment from company storage. The timestamps were clear. The signature was verified. The case seemed open and shut. Hank Buck sat at the end of the table, his hands folded, knowing his life was about to collapse. He had 2 kids at home. Rent was due in a week. His supervisor had already given a statement confirming Hank worked those shifts alone, that no one else had authorized the transfers. Then the door opened. The company's founder walked in, an elderly man named Collins Armstrong, who rarely came to these meetings anymore, who spent most of his time at the corporate office across town. He glanced at the screen, then at Hank, and his face went completely still. "Wait," Collins said, his voice cutting through the room. "I know him." The lawyers exchanged glances. "Sir, this is the employee accused of." "I know exactly who he is," Collins interrupted, his eyes locked on Hank. "He's the man who saved my life on Christmas Eve." The room seemed to freeze. Hank's supervisor, who'd been sitting confidently near the front, shifted in his seat. The timeline everyone had been so certain about suddenly didn't align, because the night in question, the night Hank was supposedly alone in the warehouse stealing equipment, he wasn't there at all. He was somewhere else entirely, doing something that would change both their lives forever. And now, with Collins Armstrong standing in that conference room, the truth was about to unravel, a lie that had been 3 weeks in the making. Before we go any further, we'd like for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. The knock came just after 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Hank Buck was in the kitchen of his small rental house, wrapping the last presents he could afford: a used skateboard for his son Danny, an art kit for his daughter Sophie. The gifts weren't much, but they were something. The house was quiet except for the hum of the space heater he kept running in the hallway. The landlord still hadn't fixed the furnace, and temperatures were dropping into the 20s outside. Hank heard the knock and froze. Nobody knocked on his door this late. Not friends, because he'd lost touch with most of them after the divorce. Not family, because his parents had passed years ago and his ex-wife's family wanted nothing to do with him. He approached the door carefully and looked through the peephole. An elderly man stood on his porch, dressed in a thin jacket and slacks, no hat, no gloves. Snow dusted his shoulders. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or something else, Hank couldn't tell. Hank opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The old man looked past him, confused, searching. "Is this Maple Street?" he asked. "I'm looking for my daughter's house. I was supposed to meet them for dinner." Hank's address was on Oak Avenue, 3 miles from any Maple Street in town. "Sir, I think you might be lost," Hank said gently. "Do you have a phone? I can help you call someone." The old man patted his pockets, then looked up with an expression that made Hank's chest tighten. It was the look of someone who just realized they were completely lost and had no idea how they'd gotten there. "I don't know," the old man said. "I was driving, and then, I don't remember stopping." Hank glanced past him at the street. No car in sight. The nearest houses were dark, curtains drawn. Everyone settled in for the holiday. He thought about his own father, who'd struggled with confusion in his final years. Thought about how terrifying it must be to not recognize where you are. "Come inside," Hank said, opening the door wider. "You're going to freeze out here." The old man hesitated, then stepped into the warmth. Hank guided him to the couch, noticed how unsteady he was on his feet, how his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He grabbed the blanket from the back of the couch, the good one he'd been saving for Sophie's bed, and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. "What's your name?" Hank asked. "Collins," the man said. "Collins Armstrong." "I'm Hank. Do you remember your daughter's phone number? Or her address?" Collins's face clouded. "I think it starts with a 4. Or maybe a 7. He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry. I can't remember." Hank kept his voice calm. "That's okay, we'll figure it out. Have you eaten?" Collins shook his head. Hank went back to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty. He'd been stretching every dollar until his next paycheck. There were 4 eggs left, half a loaf of bread, a little butter. He'd been planning to make French toast for the kids in the morning, their Christmas breakfast. He cracked all 4 eggs into a pan and made scrambled eggs with toast, brought it out to Collins with a glass of water. "Here. Eat this." Collins's hands shook too badly to hold the fork. Hank sat beside him and helped guide it, the way he used to help his own father. They sat in silence while Collins ate slowly, carefully. When he finished, Hank asked more questions, trying to piece together information. Collins remembered he lived in the city, about 40 minutes away. He remembered working in manufacturing, something about starting a business years ago, but addresses, phone numbers, his daughter's married name, all of it was just out of reach. Like trying to remember a dream after waking. I'm going to call the police. Hank said gently. They can help us find your family. Collins grabbed his wrist. No hospitals. He said. Suddenly lucid. Please. They'll keep me there. Hank saw the fear in his eyes and understood. The loss of independence. The beginning of the end. Okay, Hank said. No hospitals. But we need to find your daughter. He spent the next hour searching online. Calling non-emergency lines. Trying to find any Collins Armstrong reported missing in the area. Nothing came up. The police suggested he bring Collins to the station, but something in Hank stopped him. This man was scared and confused. Dragging him out into the cold. Into a police station on Christmas Eve. Felt wrong. Sophie appeared in the hallway around midnight, rubbing her eyes. Dad? Who's that? A friend who got lost, Hank said. Go back to bed. Sweetie. She looked at Collins. Then at her father. And something in her 6-year-old face understood. Is he okay? He will be. Hank said. Sophie went to her room and came back with her favorite stuffed bear. She walked over to Collins and held it out. You can borrow him, she said. He helps when you're scared. Collins's eyes filled with tears. He took the bear carefully, like it was made of glass. Thank you, he whispered. Hank made up the couch for Collins, gave him the warmest blanket he had, and made sure he was comfortable. Then he lay awake on the floor in the hallway, where he could hear if Collins needed anything during the night. He checked on him every hour, watching the old man's chest rise and fall, making sure he was still breathing. Around 4 a.m. Collins stirred and sat up suddenly. I have to go, he said. They'll worry. Hank was beside him in seconds. Where do you need to go? The building, Collins said, clearer now. The big one. With the trucks outside. Something clicked in Hank's memory. There was an industrial complex about 20 minutes away, several manufacturing companies, warehouses, corporate offices. Is that where you work? Hank asked. Collins nodded slowly. I think so. Dawn was breaking as Hank helped Collins into his old pickup truck. He left a note for the kids, who were still asleep, telling them he'd be back soon and to wait for him before opening presents. The drive was quiet. Collins stared out the window at the snow-covered streets, occasionally pointing at something familiar, a church, a gas station, a billboard. As they approached the industrial district, Collins sat up straighter. There, he said, pointing to a large modern building with Armstrong Manufacturing in steel letters across the front. That's it. Hank pulled up to the entrance. It was Christmas morning, so the parking lot was empty except for a security guard's car. Do you have a key, a badge? Hank asked. Collins patted his pockets and pulled out a wallet. Inside was an ID card with his photo and the company name. They walked to the entrance together, Collins leaning on Hank's arm. The security guard inside looked up in surprise as they approached. Mr. Armstrong? The guard said, standing quickly. Sir. We've been looking everywhere for you. Your daughter called last night. I'm fine. James, Collins said, his voice suddenly steadier. I just got a little turned around. The guard was already on his radio, calling someone. Within minutes, a woman in her 40s rushed through the doors, her face pale with worry. Dad! She cried, throwing her arms around Collins. Where were you? We called the police, the hospitals. I'm sorry, sweetheart, Collins said softly. I got confused, but this young man helped me. The daughter turned to Hank for the first time, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she said. Thank you so much. We thought she couldn't finish the sentence. Hank nodded. He just needed some help finding his way home. Collins gripped Hank's hand firmly. His eyes were clear now, focused. You didn't have to do what you did, he said. Most people would have called the authorities and moved on with their night. It's Christmas, Hank said simply. Nobody should be alone and scared on Christmas. 40. Collins looked at him for a long moment. Then reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. This has my daughter's number on it, he said. Call her tomorrow. I want to thank you properly. Hank took the card, not really planning to use it, and watched as Collins's daughter guided him toward the building. He drove home as the sun rose fully over the horizon. Danny and Sophie were awake when he got back, bouncing with excitement. They opened their modest presents with the kind of pure joy that made Hank's chest ache. Sophie hugged her art kit like it was treasure. Danny immediately wanted to try the skateboard. Even though there was snow on the ground, for a few hours, everything felt okay. Hank forgot about the bills piling up on the counter. Forgot about his worries about the future. He just watched his kids be happy, and that was enough. He didn't know that in 3 weeks, everything would fall apart. He didn't know that the kindness he'd shown Collins Armstrong would be the only thing standing between him and total ruin. Hank returned to work the day after Christmas. He'd been employed at Metro Distribution Center for 3 years, working the warehouse floor driving forklifts, managing inventory, loading trucks. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and his supervisor had hinted at a promotion if he kept his head down and worked hard. His supervisor was a woman named Georgia Woodward, and she'd been with the company for over a decade. She was efficient, professional, always dressed in pressed slacks and company polo shirts even when everyone else wore jeans. She ran the warehouse floor with precision, and most of the workers respected her, even if she wasn't particularly warm. That morning, Georgia approached Hank with a clipboard. "Buck, I need you on a special project today," she said. "We're moving some equipment to off-site storage. I'll authorize the transfers, but I need you to handle the physical logistics." "Sure," Hank said. "Which units?" Georgia handed him a list. "Expensive equipment, industrial machinery parts, high-end tools, computer systems. These all going to the same place?" Hank asked. "Different locations," Georgia said. "I'll log everything in the system. You just need to load the trucks and get signatures from the receiving warehouses." Hank spent the next 2 days moving equipment. He followed Georgia's instructions exactly, loading specified items into rental trucks, driving them to various storage facilities across the county, getting signatures from warehouse managers. It all seemed routine. Georgia was always there when he returned, checking off items on her clipboard, telling him he was doing good work. "I'm putting in a recommendation for you," she said on the second day. "You've been reliable. We need more people like you in leadership positions." Hank allowed himself to hope. A promotion would mean more money, better insurance for the kids, maybe even enough to move to a place with a working furnace. The week passed. New Year's came and went. Hank settled back into his regular routine morning shifts, picking the kids up from his neighbor who watched them after school, microwaving dinners, helping with homework, collapsing into bed exhausted. Then, 3 weeks after Christmas, Hank arrived at work to find the warehouse gates closed. Security guards stood at the entrance. "What's going on?" Hank asked. "We need to see your badge," one of the guards said. Hank handed it over. The guard spoke into his radio, then nodded. "You need to come with us." Hank's stomach dropped. He was escorted to the main office building, up to the second floor where he'd never been before, and into a conference room. Georgia was already there, sitting with 2 men in suits, corporate investigators. He learned later. "Sit down, Mr. Buck," one of them said. Hank sat. His hands were shaking. "There's been a significant inventory discrepancy," the investigator continued. "Equipment worth approximately $75,000 has gone missing from our warehouse over the past 3 weeks." Hank's mouth went dry. "I don't understand." The investigator slid a stack of papers across the table. Transfer forms. Each one signed with Hank's name, dated over the past weeks. "These transfers were never authorized," the investigator said. "The equipment was sold to third-party buyers. The money never made it into company accounts." "But I was following orders," Hank said, looking at Georgia. "You told me to move that equipment. You said you were logging it." Georgia's face was perfectly composed. "I never gave those orders," she said calmly. "Mr. Buck worked those shifts alone. I was off-site during most of those transfers." Hank felt the room tilt. "That's not true. You were there. You gave me the lists. You told me where to. Do you have any proof of these conversations?" the investigator asked. Hank opened his mouth and realized he didn't. No emails. No text messages. Just verbal instructions from his supervisor, which he'd followed without question because that's what you did when your boss told you to do something. If this part makes sense, drop a comment with, "I'm still here, let's see who's really watching this far." "We're suspending you immediately," the investigator said. "Without pay, pending criminal investigation. If charges are filed, you'll be notified by the police." Hank sat frozen as they took his badge, his keys, everything with the company logo. Security escorted him off the property. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, unable to process what had just happened. His phone buzzed. A text from his landlord asking about this month's rent. Another from the after-school program saying his account was past due. Hank put his head against the steering wheel and tried to breathe. He'd been set up. Georgia had used him to steal from the company, covered her tracks, and left him holding the bag. But he had no way to prove it. No evidence. No witnesses. Just his word against hers, and she'd been with the company for 10 years while he was just a warehouse worker who'd recently shown up late to a shift because he'd been helping a confused old man on Christmas Eve. The next 2 weeks were the darkest of Hank's life. No income. No prospects. Every job application he filled out asked if he'd ever been accused of theft, if he was under investigation, if he'd been terminated from previous employment. He couldn't lie, but telling the truth meant no callbacks. His savings ran out within days. He sold his TV, his laptop, anything with value. He called his ex-wife to ask if she could take the kids for a while, just until he got back on his feet, but she'd remarried and moved 3 states away. Her new husband didn't want his kids around. The neighbor who usually watched Danny and Sophie after school said she couldn't do it anymore without payment. Hank had to pull them from their after-school program. They came home to an empty house now, and he hated himself for it every single day. Sophie stopped asking about dinner when the food got sparse. Danny grew quiet, watching his father with worried eyes that looked too old for a 9-year-old. Hank called legal aid clinics, but none of them could help without evidence he didn't have. He called the police, but they said the case was still under investigation and he should contact a lawyer. Everything was circular. Every door led to another locked door. One night, Danny asked, "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" Hank looked at his son and didn't know what to say. He thought about lying, about giving the reassuring answer a parent is supposed to give. Instead, he just pulled Danny into a hug and held on tight. "I'm trying," Hank said. "I'm trying so hard." The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. 30 days to vacate. Hank stared at the paper and felt something break inside him. He'd worked his entire adult life, paid his taxes, followed the rules, and one person's lie had destroyed everything. That night, he lay awake and thought about Collins Armstrong. Wondered if the old man even remembered that night. Wondered if helping him had been worth it, given where Hank was now. He pulled out the business card Collins had given him, still in his wallet, crumpled but readable. He'd never called. Pride, maybe, or not wanting to bother someone who'd already been through enough. But now, sitting in a house he was about to lose with 2 kids depending on him, Hank had nothing left to lose. He called the number the next morning. A woman answered, Collins's daughter. "This is Hank Buck," he said. "I helped your father on Christmas Eve. He asked me to call." There was a pause. "Of course. My dad talks about you constantly. He wanted to thank you, but we weren't sure how to reach you." "I'm sorry to ask this," Hank said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I'm in trouble. I've been accused of something I didn't do, and I don't know where else to turn." Collins Armstrong's daughter arranged a meeting 3 days later. Hank drove to the Armstrong Manufacturing Building, the same place he dropped Collins off on Christmas morning. He was escorted upstairs to an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Collins stood when Hank entered. He looked healthier than he had that night, steadier, clearer-eyed. "Hank," he said warmly, shaking his hand. "Sit down. Tell me what happened." Hank explained everything: the equipment transfers, George's instructions, the investigation, his suspension. Collins listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Do you have any proof that your supervisor gave you these orders?" Collins asked. "No," Hank admitted. "It was all verbal. I was just trying to do my job." Collins was quiet for a moment, then picked up his phone. "Sarah, can you come in here, please? And bring the legal team." Within an hour, Hank was surrounded by lawyers, investigators, and company executives. He told his story again, answered every question they asked, provided every detail he could remember. "Metro Distribution is one of our subsidiary companies," Collins explained. "I founded Armstrong Manufacturing 40 years ago, and we've acquired several related businesses over the years. I don't manage the day-to-day anymore, but I still oversee major issues." "This is definitely a major issue," one of the lawyers said. "If what Mr. Buck is saying is true, we have a serious internal theft problem." "I believe him," Collins said simply. The room fell silent. "Sir, with respect," one of the executives said carefully, "we can't just take his word for it. There's evidence against him." "Then find evidence for him," Collins said. "He saved my life. The least we can do is make sure we have the full truth before we destroy his." The investigation took a week. Collins's legal team tore through every record at Metro Distribution Center. They pulled security footage that the original investigators had apparently overlooked. They interviewed warehouse workers who'd been too afraid to speak up before. And slowly, a different picture emerged. Georgia Woodward had been running a systematic theft operation for over a year. She'd identify new employees who seemed desperate or vulnerable, give them verbal instructions for transfers, then deny everything when the discrepancies were discovered. She'd done it 3 times before Hank. Each time, the accused employee had been fired or quit before any formal charges were filed. Too poor to fight back, too scared to make noise. But she'd made a mistake with Hank. She'd chosen someone who happened to help the company's founder on Christmas Eve. Someone Collins Armstrong remembered. Someone worth fighting for. The evidence was compiled into a comprehensive report. Bank records showing deposits into George's accounts that matched the dates of stolen equipment sales. Text messages with buyers that she'd thought she'd deleted but that IT recovered. Security footage showing her giving Hank instructions. Footage that contradicted her sworn statement that she was off-site. The company called a meeting. Every executive who'd been involved in Hank's suspension was required to attend. Hank was asked to be there too, though he wasn't sure why. He sat at a conference table in the same building where Collins worked, watching executives file in, watching Georgia arrive last with a confident stride that faltered when she saw the lawyers. The presentation began. Evidence laid out systematically. Bank records. Messages. Footage. Georgia's face went from confident to pale to panicked. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Miss Woodward. You're being terminated immediately," one of the executives said. "We'll be referring this case to law enforcement for criminal prosecution." Security escorted her out. She didn't look at Hank as she passed. The room cleared slowly until it was just Hank, Collins, and a few senior executives. "Mr. Buck," one of them said. "On behalf of Armstrong Manufacturing and Metro Distribution Center, we apologize. Your suspension is lifted immediately. You'll receive full back pay plus compensation for the hardship this caused." Hank nodded, not quite able to process it. "We'd also like to offer you a new position," Collins said. "Operations Supervisor. Full benefits. Salary commensurate with the responsibility." Hank stared at him. "I don't understand. Why would you?" "Because you answered your door on Christmas Eve," Collins said simply. "Because you fed a confused old man with the last food in your house. Because you didn't have to help me. But you did anyway. That's the kind of person we want leading our teams." Hank started his new position in February. The salary was triple what he'd been making in the warehouse. He paid his back rent, caught up on bills, took Danny and Sophie shopping for clothes that actually fit. He moved them to a new place, nothing fancy, but it had heat that worked and bedrooms for both kids. Sophie decorated her room with the art she'd made from the Christmas kit. Danny's skateboard hung on the wall like a trophy. Collins visited sometimes. They'd have coffee in Hank's office. Talk about work. About life. About how strange it was that one night could change everything. "I don't remember much about that night," Collins admitted once. "But I remember feeling safe. I remember your daughter giving me her bear. She still asks about you," Hank said. "Wants to know if you're okay." "Tell her I'm doing better," Collins said. Thanks to her father. 6 months later, legal papers arrived at Hank's apartment. He opened them with shaking hands, afraid of what new problem might be emerging. Instead, he found something impossible. Collins had named him in his will. Not as an inheritor, Collins had children and grandchildren for that, but as executor. As someone entrusted with making sure his company continued to operate with integrity after he was gone. "I can't accept this," Hank said when he called Collins. "I'm not qualified for your exactly qualified." Collins interrupted. "You know what it's like to be powerless. You know what it means when someone in authority abuses their position. That's the qualification that matters." Hank hung up the phone and looked around his apartment. At the furniture he could now afford. At his kids' school projects on the refrigerator. At the life that had almost been destroyed by one person's lie and had been saved by one act of kindness he'd almost not done. Christmas Eve came again a year later. Hank stood at his window watching snow fall, remembering the knock that had changed his life. His phone rang. It was Collins. "Just wanted to check in," the older man said. "Make sure you're not taking in any more confused strangers." Hank laughed. "Just my kids tonight." "Good. That's good." There was a pause. "Thank you, Hank. For everything." "I didn't do anything special," Hank said. "Yes, you did," Collins replied. "You saw someone who needed help and you helped them. You'd be surprised how rare that is." After they hung up, Hank thought about that. About how close he'd come to not answering his door. About how easy it would have been to call the authorities and go back to wrapping presents. About how one choice, made without thinking, had saved both of them. Danny and Sophie were in the living room arguing over what movie to watch. Normal kid stuff. Beautiful, ordinary chaos. Hank joined them on the couch and pulled them close. "I love you guys," he said. "I know, Dad," Sophie said, rolling her eyes in that way she'd started doing lately, but she snuggled closer anyway. The movie started, but Hank wasn't really watching. He was thinking about kindness. About how it doesn't always pay off immediately. About how sometimes you help someone and never hear from them again, and that's okay because the helping itself was the point. But sometimes, rarely, Unexpectedly, kindness becomes a thread that connects two lives. A thread that, when pulled at just the right moment, can save you from drowning. Collins Armstrong had been that thread for him. And Hank had been that thread for Collins. Neither of them had planned it. Neither of them had expected anything in return. They just answered a knock on a door and decided that another person's well-being mattered more than convenience. If this story made you think about the small choices you make every day, the ones that seem insignificant until they're not, then it served its purpose. Because somewhere right now, someone is knocking on a door. Someone needs help. And someone else is deciding whether to answer. What would you do? How would you feel if you were in Hank's position, falsely accused with no one to believe you? Or in Collins's position, lost and afraid with nowhere to turn? Drop a comment and let us know. These stories matter because they remind us that we're all one moment away from needing grace, and one choice away from giving it. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when no one is watching, and about how those choices echo in ways we can't always predict. Thanks for being here.